Okay, let us move on now to two other huge important systems in the body, obviously, circulation and respiration. The circulatory system is composed of the heart and the various blood vessels, arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries and veins are the big blood vessels, and capillaries are the small blood vessels. The central component of the circulatory system is, of course, the heart. We as human beings have four chambers in our heart, two ventricles and two atria. The atria are in the upper left and upper right hand corner, the right atrium and the left atrium. Then you have the ventricles. The difference between those two is that the atria accept the blood and the ventricles pump them. Basically, the blood comes in from the rest of the body to the heart through one of the atria, and then it goes into the ventricle, and the ventricle then pumps it. It's kind of like a pump. It's hard to describe offhand, but one part of the pump allows the water or whatever it is in, then the other part squeezes it out. There are two sides to the heart because one of the sides pumps the blood directly to the lungs to get oxygen, and then the other to the rest of the body. The one that goes to the lung is called the pulmonary, because pulmonary means having to do with the lung. So you can see over here that just in this diagram, you've got blood coming in the pulmonary vein. By the way, the difference between a vein and an artery is that the vein brings blood to the heart, whereas the artery brings blood away from the heart. So let's just quickly take a look at the path of blood through. Let's start up here. And it would go into the heart and the right atrium, then to the right ventricle. Then it gets pumped into the pulmonary artery, which is the artery that goes to the lung. It goes up here and then goes eventually to the lung where it gets oxygenated and gets the oxygen supply. Then it comes back around and scoots back into the heart through the pulmonary vein. Again, this is a vein because it's carrying blood to the heart, and it's pulmonary because it's coming from the lung. Into the left atrium, then to the left ventricle, then the left ventricle pumps it throughout the body. Notice the left ventricle has to be the strongest part of the heart because it's going to pump the blood all the way throughout the body, whereas the right ventricle is only going to pump it the relatively short distance to the lungs. Okay, so let's look at the parts of the heart. It's made of four chambers, as we discussed: the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, and left ventricle. And most of the heart is muscle, very strong muscle, because it's got to pump all that blood throughout the body. The left ventricle has the thickest layer of muscle because it has to pump the blood throughout the body, as opposed to the right ventricle, which only has to pump blood to the lungs, which is a relatively short distance away. Then you have the SA node, which is the pacemaker. The pacemaker is the thing that causes the heart to pump properly. You may think, when you hear the word pacemaker, you may think of an artificial pacemaker. People that have heart troubles who are not able to, where their heart, or people that really their hearts are not able to regulate its pumping. Pace, you can probably think the word pace means the speed at which, or the rate in terms of time at which something is done. So if the heart, for whatever reason, is not able to time itself properly so that it pumps pump, accept, once every second and a half, whatever the case may be. Actually, it's more like once a second. Assuming 60 pumps a minute, it's about one per second. Or even if you're exercising, you have more. You have like 2 pumps per second. Whatever. The point is that the task of the SA node and the pacemaker is to coordinate contractions of the heart. And if a person heart can't work in itself, you have artificial pacemakers. An artificial pacemaker is a relatively small, I have a little picture over here of an artificial pacemaker. You can see how small it is. It's really only a few inches big. And people wear it inside their body, and it regulates the pumping of the heart. It doesn't actually do the heart pumping, that has to be the body itself, but it regulates when the heart does its own pumping. And the purpose of all this, what the heart's idea is, to try to get blood throughout the body. Now, blood, why is blood necessary? Well, blood does a lot of stuff that you need. What blood is, it's a transport mechanism. It transports oxygen throughout the body. It transports food throughout the body. It transports hormones throughout the body. Remember, secretions made by the thyroid or the pancreas, like insulin, or the liver or the pituitary gland, need to get around the body some way, and the only way to get there is through the blood. So when the pituitary needs to get a secretion around the blood, it just pumps it into the blood, and the blood then spreads it throughout the body. Blood is made of plasma, which is most of the blood volume, 55 to 60%, which is basically a liquid, watery substance. That's what makes the blood liquidy, because it's made up mostly of plasma. And also you've got red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The red blood cells carry the oxygen, the white blood cells fight off infection, and the platelets are necessary in order to clot the blood. Like when you get a cut, after a couple of minutes, hopefully, if the cut's not too deep, or the cut you're healthy and all that, after a couple of minutes, the blood will start to clot, it'll start to congeal, and the bleeding will stop. Sometimes you need to put a bandage or press it if the cut is too deep, or if there's a big wound, in order to kind of stem the tide while it has an opportunity to clot. And most of these cells, these red blood cells, which is what gives blood its red color, are oxygen-carrying red blood cells. They're called erythrocytes, and how many of them there are, it determines how much oxygen the blood can carry. In fact, there is a hormone, erythropoietin, if I'm pronouncing that correct. But anyway, this regulates and maintains the appropriate number of blood cells. That is caused by the it's a hormone, of course. It is produced in the kidney, and it regulates the number of red blood cells there are. Sometimes if a person takes an extra amount of this hormone, they can have more red blood cells. Now, if you think about what more red blood cells will do, is it'll give you more energy. Because remember, what do they carry to the cells? They carry oxygen. What does oxygen do? Oxygen allows aerobic respiration, and aerobic respiration is obviously necessary and critical for us to produce energy. So it causes of course, the counter side, the bad side, is something that you could have levels of oxygen that are too low. That could cause, because there's a loss of blood, if you lose too much blood, that could cause oxygen levels that are too low because you lost too many of these red blood cells. High altitude. When you breathe in air in Denver, which is 5,000 feet up, or on Pikes Peak, which is 14,000 feet up, or on the top of Everest, which is 30,000 feet up, the higher you go, the less oxygen there is in the air, the less you get with each breath. If you're on the top of Pikes Peak or something, you're 14,000 feet up, you might find yourself panting, breathing in a little bit more deeply, or a little bit more tired, and the reason there's just less oxygen. So there's less oxygen that gets into your blood, and therefore less oxygen that your body can use, and you're going to have a little bit less energy. If you're too high, like on the top of Everest, most people wouldn't be able to survive. In fact, pretty much nobody would be able to survive unless you have some sort of an oxygen mask or an artificial supply of oxygen. This could cause an insufficient amount of hemoglobin. I didn't mention this before, but hemoglobin is the substance that carries the blood that is present in the red blood cells. So hemoglobin is a necessary component of the red blood cells. In fact, it's really the whole point of the red blood cells. Conditions like respiratory problems, inability to breathe properly, or heart failure, of course, could impact the ability to maintain the appropriate level of oxygen. Another disease is called anemia, like sickle cell anemia or different types of anemia, that's caused by an inadequate number of erythrocytes, in other words, an inadequate number of red blood cells that are caused by a variety of different factors. And, as you can imagine, one big symptom of anemia is weakness. Sometimes people will say, you may have heard the expression, if somebody is very weak, they might say he's anemic today. And the reason why is because anemia means you don't have enough oxygen, which means you're going to have a decrease in energy. In terms of blood, you've got oxygenated blood, which is bright red, and deoxygenated blood, which is dark red, like maroon red. So the difference is that oxygenated blood will be oxygenated. Blood will have oxygen in it if it's coming from the lung. Once it goes to the lung, it gets its oxygen. Heart pumps it throughout the body. After it's been around the body, what's it been doing the whole time? It's been giving out oxygen. It's like a delivery truck. After it's made all its stops and given out all its oxygen on its way back to the heart, well, then it's going to be deoxygenated. That's why when people bleed, they tend to bleed a little bit of a darker red, because when you bleed, very often you're bleeding from a vein. If you pump blood from a vein, and a vein is bringing the blood back to the heart, so it's probably going to be a little bit darker. Contrary to the rumor, blood is not actually bluish, even though your veins are bluish. If you see them through the skin, the blood itself is not blue, even if it has no oxygen. The blood, of course, has to regulate itself, and here's another example of feedback. If you have an oxygen deficiency, you don't have enough oxygen in the blood, then the erythropoietin could be produced by the kidney, which is the hormone that increases the number of red blood cells and hemoglobin. That, of course, produces red blood cells. The red blood cells themselves are produced in the marrow, and they carry around more of these red blood cells with more hemoglobin, with more oxygen, and that causes a restored oxygen level. And then once you have the oxygen level back to normal, then that stops the erythropoietin from being produced anymore, because it is no longer necessary. Very closely related to the heart and the circulatory system is the respiratory system. And the respiratory system essentially includes the lungs and the pipes that get oxygen into the body and carbon dioxide out of the body. Respiration is the process, well, respiration in the cell, cellular respiration means the production of energy, but when you're talking about on a system-wide level, the respiration is the process by which organisms exchange gas with the environment, and that supports cellular respiration. Cellular respiration needs oxygen to do aerobic respiration, and it also produces carbon dioxide. Well, if the cells are going to need oxygen and produce carbon dioxide, that means the body eventually is going to have to get oxygen in, and it's going to have to release carbon dioxide out. And that process is, of course, called breathing. You breathe oxygen in and put carbon dioxide out. Respiration in humans takes place in the alveoli, which are tiny little air sacs that are in the lung. Here's an example of what the respiratory system in general looks like. You've got the sinuses, or the mouth. As we all know, air you can breathe in or out either through your nose or through your mouth. Then you've got the trachea down here, which is the windpipe, which is the thing that the gas goes in and out of. Carbon dioxide goes up when you breathe out. Oxygen goes down when you breathe in. And then you have the lungs, and lungs are millions and millions and millions of these tiny little air sacs called the alveoli. Each alveolus, which is the singular for alveoli, is kind of like the end of a pipe, the end of the trachea, the end of the bronchial tubes. These things are these little tubes that go all over the place are the bronchioles, or the bronchial tubes. If you have bronchitis, for example, it means it's an inflammation of the bronchial tubes. There's a problem with the lining to your lungs being inflamed, and that's why you cough a lot, because it's very inflamed over there. And these alveoli, they cause gas exchange with the blood capillaries. You can see these purple things over here. These are blood capillaries that wind around the bronchioles and wind around the alveoli, and oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged through that. The blood gives all of its carbon dioxide to the alveoli, and the alveoli gives its oxygen to the blood. So when you breathe in, you're taking oxygen down into the alveoli, and that goes into the bloodstream. And then quickly the bloodstream gives away its carbon dioxide to the alveoli, and then you breathe out, and the carbon dioxide in the alveoli gets expelled into the environment through your mouth or nose. All different organisms have different types of respiratory structures, and they are required to facilitate the diffusion of gases, which means the exchange of gases between the organism and the environment. Most of these are moist, like your mouth. Well, obviously your mouth is moist, but the bronchial tubes in general are moist. In some ways, that even exposes them to infection because of the fact that bacteria like to live in warm, moist places, and your bronchial tubes are warm, moist places. So the respiratory surfaces are thin to minimize diffusion differences, In other words, to allow easy diffusion back and forth, to allow gas exchange relatively easily. And they have a large surface area. I mean, think about the lungs. Think about that each of these little tubes ends in millions of these alveoli over here. You can imagine the amount of surface area that's in your lungs. The amount of these alveoli, if you counted millions of these and they're round and shaped like bubbles like that, that's really a lot of surface area, because that's really necessary in order to get enough surface area to transport the appropriate gases to and from the blood. Skin of an earthworm. You know, earthworms actually breathe through their skin. We don't do that. You know, fish breathe through their gills, trachea, and humans and other mammals use these alveoli, which I showed you a picture of a moment ago. Breathing in is done through inhalation and exhalation. Breathe in, that's inhalation. Breathe out, that's exhalation. In inhalation, the chest cavity is enlarged, and the diaphragm, which is the muscle underneath the lungs, you can see in this diagram, which I'll put back up over here, this is the diaphragm down here. And when the diaphragm relaxes, it moves back up and pushes the lungs so that the air is driven out of the body. And when the diaphragm contracts, it moves down, and therefore there's more space for the lungs. Think of the lungs like a balloon. When the diaphragm relaxes, it moves up and squishes the balloon a little bit, moving the air out. And when it contracts, these muscles down here near the ribs contract, drawing the diaphragm down, causing the lungs to expand. Okay, I found you a little moving diagram over here that illustrates this point, from Wikipedia, of course. This is inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Because the muscles that control the diaphragm are down here. So when they contract and they pull, the system goes down and you breathe in, because these balloons, these lungs get bigger. And then when they relax and they contract, they go back up, and that pushes the balloon smaller and gets rid of the air that is in your lungs. Okay, this we discussed before a little bit. This is the gas exchange. This is the heart, of course, in the middle. This is the lungs and the alveoli that are over here. And this is the rest of the body. So, of course, the lungs have to pump the blood to the heart, where it picks up all this oxygen and gives away all this carbon dioxide. Then it comes back to the heart, and the heart then pumps it to the rest of the body. So remember, in the right atrium, up the right ventricle to the lungs, getting rid of the carbon dioxide and taking in the oxygen from the alveoli. Back to the heart in the left atrium, then to the left ventricle, and then back to the body, where it gives away its oxygen and takes in the carbon dioxide. The brain, of course, has to control the heart and has to control the entire respiratory system. The medulla is the part of the brain that is the respiratory control center. Brain damage the medulla is the lowest part of the brain, by the way. We're going to learn it later. You have the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the medulla. The medulla controls involuntary activities like breathing. Now, breathing is considered an involuntary activity, even though you could control yourself. You could stop yourself from breathing, but if you're asleep or you're not paying attention, you still automatically breathe, so therefore it is considered involuntary. So, and if a brain could become damaged, that could cause irregular breathing. Even though the lungs are fine and the heart is fine, trachea is fine, bronchi is fine, bronchial tubes are fine, everything is fine, brain damage could cause irregular breathing, because the brain is the thing that tells the diaphragm muscles when to contract and when to expand, and if the breathing is not done properly, then it could mess up the system, even if all the parts themselves are okay. And as we discussed before, when a person runs, you'll start gasping for breath or breathing faster because you've reached your endurance level and the body needs more oxygen. The body's essentially saying, get us more oxygen, get us more oxygen, get us more oxygen, and get rid of carbon dioxide. Remember, when you run, you respirate faster. When you respirate faster, you produce more carbon dioxide and you use up more oxygen. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of multiple choice questions. Josh requires a heart transplant because of a significant amount of damage. Until he's available, he's connected to an artificial pacemaker, which mimics and replaces the SN node, sinoatrial node. That is the natural pacemaker that the artificial pacemaker is designed to replicate. So we'll say B for that. All of the following are respiratory surfaces except Well, trachea of a fly, of course, trachea is a gas exchange mechanism. Gills of a fish, gills are used by fish to breathe. Skin of an earthworm, as we discussed, the earthworm does breathe through its skin. Bat wings, bats are mammals, which means they have lungs just like we do, so that's out. So that D looks like the correct answer. And of course, alveoli of a lion are are mammal alveoli just like human alveoli, so they're also respiratory surfaces.